This is Audible.
Audible Inc. presents The Brenner Assignment, the untold story of the most daring spy mission of World War II, written by Patrick K. O'Donnell, narrated by Dennis Boutsikaris.
Prologue. May 1945, Andrić, Italy. A gray-green bottle glistened in the alpine snow. A blackened cork protected its fragile content, a yellowed piece of paper. The bottle, part of a collection of bottles buried next to the wall of a little house in the tiny Italian mountain village of Andrić, held the written legacy of a bold young saboteur. Peering at the bottles, Captain Howard Wheeler Chappell vaguely recalled a lesson from his days in grammar school. History tells the story of a Japanese captain stranded on a reef. The shipwrecked skipper recorded his plight on a thin plank of wood, placed it in a bottle, corked it, and set it adrift. Almost magically, the bottle made landfall at the captain's home port, finally delivering his message. Throughout the ages, messages have been transported in such small glass vessels. These bottles, buried in the Italian snow, served the same purpose, preserving the story of Chappell's fellow officer. They contained the diary and letters of his brother-in-arms, Captain Roderick Stephen Godspeed Hall. As he stood above the bottles, Chappell was also standing in the middle of a journey into his recent past. The officer did not know the bottles would send him back to learn more about Hall's sojourn behind the lines, revisiting familiar places and familiar souls. No stranger to battle, Chappell had just survived one of the epic covert missions of World War II. Bearded, wearing a dirty, ragged M42 paratrooper jumpsuit, he was physically and mentally exhausted, but emotionally victorious. A stale odor emerged as Chappell's powerful hand pulled out the cork. He unrolled the brittle yellow paper and scanned Hall's neat handwriting. The letter contained clues to one of the great untold stories of World War II, the adventures of a young man fighting behind enemy lines, enduring great hardship on a solitary quest to cripple Nazi Germany. Chappell focused on a single sentence embodying both men's missions. I perfected a plan for blowing out one of the tunnels on the railroad through the Brenner. The Brenner, one of the most famous and important mountain passes in the world. Hall's life for the last 2 years had been aimed toward getting there, and the bottled messages he left in Andrić were a mere 60 miles away. As the crucial supply and communication corridor through the Alps, the pass had been fought over by rival armies since Roman times. When Adolf Hitler and Italian leader Benito Mussolini personally met there at the beginning of World War II, shaking hands to memorialize their infamous Pact of Steel, the pass connecting Italy and Austria gained symbolic importance, and Hall meant to strike at its heart. Chappell and a crack team of commandos had come to back him up. The Brenner Pass was no less important to Nazi Germany than it was to ancient Rome. Through the Brenner's railroad tunnels and highways flowed the troops and supplies that sustained the German armies fighting the Allies farther to the south. Control of this vital throughway determined whether these armies would fight on or wither on the vine. The Brenner was a carotid artery of the Third Reich and the point of convergence of Hall's and Chappell's lives. Chapter 1. Letter to Destiny. A plume of matte black smoke billowed from the locomotive stack, and gritty soot stippled the rolling mass of clouds that began to cover the star-filled night as the 15-car train sped down the steel tracks toward a rural army camp north of Corvallis, Oregon. An arc of white lightning signaled an imminent storm. During the wee hours before the northwestern dawn, a light in one of the passenger cars flickered as Lieutenant Roderick Stephen Hall put the final touches on a letter that would change his life. Writing to a deputy at the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, OSS, he was proposing to undertake one of the most audacious sabotage missions of World War II. Dear Mr. Stebbins, it seems to me, who knows nothing about your organization, OSS, that finding an agent with the necessary personal accoutrement to go to Cortina on the southwest approaches of the Brenner Pass and carry out missions of sabotage, Political organization, reconnaissance, or whatever is desired would be difficult. Even if he was a European, he would encounter official questioning at every turn, with danger of exposure each time. And traveling by land, how could he carry sufficient explosives and tools to effect sabotage himself if all other plans failed? These obstacles could, of course, be overcome one way or another, but here is my suggestion, based on the premise that sabotage is more important in the near future than political organization. Drop a man by parachute on the open country between Pokol and the Fazorego Pass, and drop enough Army mountain rations and personal equipment to sustain him indefinitely in the peaks, if necessary. Drop TNT and a toolkit. I believe one could get away with it if the jump was made in the early dawn when mist rises profusely over the terrain or through a snowfall. This man, if he is a good rock and snow climber and skier, would have no trouble moving about the valley unnoticed, even in the daytime. The matter of tracks in the snow is of no consequence. Paths and brooks could cover his movements, and he could always take to the mountain rock. Operating even under adverse conditions, this man, I believe, could block the Empezzo Highway and railroad beyond use during the winter within 3 days after he landed. It should be possible for him to blow out the Drava River roads within another 10 days. Thereafter, he could work on any opportunities that presented themselves. I feel sure he would not have to search out anti-Nazi elements for laying the plans for continued sabotage. They would come to him. Of course, the problem of how he would get out and save his own skin is a matter of chance and circumstance. Perhaps he would have to perch on the peak of Untalau, nibbling concentrated chocolate until German capitulation. I would be willing to do the job, and I think I could. Here are my qualifications. Trained in military demolitions. Trained in mapping, reconnaissance, communications, and similar subjects. I am Battalion S2, familiar with the Val Empezzo, particularly the well-known pass and minor terrain features from walks and skiing. Skilled in rock and snow climbing with 15 years' experience on the cliffs and snow of Northeast in Wyoming, Grand Tetons, and Cortina. Expert rifle and pistol shot since 1930, National Rifle Association and Army. Physically, somewhat above average. Endurance, accustomed to living in the open under all conditions. No major operations, illnesses, or frailties. 28 years of age. Education. I am no linguist, but I have picked up enough Italian in 5 days at Cortina to get about conveniently. Personal situation? Unmarried. Ready to go any time, under any circumstances that augur success. Cordially yours, R.S.G. Hall, 2nd Lieutenant, 270th Engineer Combat Battalion, Camp-Adair, Oregon. The roads and valleys Hall cited all led to the great mountain pass that links Italy with Austria and the rest of Western Europe, the Brenner. Specifically, Hall was proposing to cut off the small arteries that fed the major artery. The scheme was novel, innovative, and bordering on suicidal. Roderick Stephen Goodspeed Hall, born in Peking, China in 1915, came from a privileged background. His father Raymond was influential in the State Department, a wealthy international businessman with a Ph.D. His mother was a doctor. As a young man, he received his education at Phillips Academy, Andover, one of the most prestigious prep schools in America. Known as Monk, Goodspeed, or Rod, his charismatic nature earned him many friends at school. He scored high in drama, Latin, and history, but received a C- for neatness. After graduating from Andover in 1933, the 18-year-old traveled the world embarking on a lifetime journey that would take him on numerous adventures in many exotic places. He began his sojourn as a sailor on a steamer traveling up and down the West Coast and moved on to work in the oil fields of Texas. Like Theodore Roosevelt, he also became a committed outdoorsman. An avid skier and rock climber, he tested his mettle climbing the Grand Tetons of Wyoming. After a few years experiencing life in the outdoors, Hall put his journey on hold to attend Harvard University. He earned mediocre grades, dropped out after a couple of semesters, and went to Italy for the 1937-38 winter on a ski trip. The experience changed his life. Cortina d'Ampezzo is roughly 150 miles northwest of Venice and 60 miles southwest of the Brenner Pass. The landscape is breathtaking. The dominant features are the gray-faced snow-capped Dolomites, a mountain range forming part of the lower Alps, which run from Italy through Switzerland and Austria. Playing the part of the international playboy, Hall enjoyed the good life, staying at a famous Cortina resort known as the Hotel Argentina. Hiking, rock climbing, and cross-country skiing filled his days. Hall's first-hand experience with the Brenner area would later prove valuable for his clandestine mission in World War II. After returning to the United States, Hall tried his hand again at academics, this time at Yale. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini were solidifying their pact of steel, planning to carve up most of Western Europe. After Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, the country fell quickly. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen, and likewise, once again, had Hall's academic standing. In 1941, Hall had again dropped out of college and was searching once more for purpose or another adventure. With the winds of war blowing toward America, Hall patriotically joined the U.S. Army as a private, an enlisted man. Army life suited him. Because he quickly grew bored, he eagerly took on new projects, and his energy and enthusiasm catapulted him rapidly through the ranks to staff sergeant. He impressed his commanding officer by taking on the task of writing a comprehensive history of his regiment from the Revolutionary War to 1941. Hall was realizing his potential. 26 years old, 5'10", muscular, good-looking, intelligent, and with a flair for leadership, Hall was now in his prime. His commander recommended him for Officer Candidate School, OCS. While he was at OCS, he was fascinated by the war and came to believe that a single individual could make a difference. Hall had a messianic faith in himself, and he set out to conceive a plan he could execute personally that would alter the course of the war. During his spare time, Hall began devising his plan for the Brenner Pass, hoping that someday it would become his Brenner assignment. On paper, the scheme seemed workable, but would he ever have a chance to try his plan? As the circumstances unfolded, reality on the ground would eclipse even Hall's best-laid plans. Sporting his brand-new lieutenant's gold bars, the Army assigned Hall to the 270th Engineer Battalion, a unit gearing up for war at Camp Adair, a former logging camp a few miles north of Corvallis, Oregon. Because of its 50,000 acres of variable terrain, the War Department had chosen Camp Adair as the location to train 4 infantry divisions, the 91st, the 96th, the 104th, and the 70th. The 70th, known as the Trailblazer Division, ultimately gobbled up Hall's 270th Engineers. During the war, Corvallis became the second-largest city in Oregon. The hard-charging soldiers dubbed the camp Swamp Adair for the constant downpours. Under these damp and rugged conditions, Hall learned the core skills of a combat engineer, how to build things and how to blow things up. Hall learned to erect bridges and fortifications and even lay minefields, but of greater importance to him, he became an expert in demolitions. The budding engineer also mastered the fundamental tools of the infantryman, the pistol and the rifle. As a soldier capable of fighting with his brain as well as brawn, Hall became his company's intelligence chief, known as S2, assuming responsibility for collecting and analyzing information about what an enemy could do to thwart a unit's mission in the field. Hall's S2 duties required him to develop a set of intelligence handling skills that would come in handy for a behind-the-lines secret agent. During his time at Camp Adair, Hall was unwittingly preparing himself for the adventure of his life. By the time of the invasion of Italy in 1943, Hall began to see that the hour for his Brenner plan was approaching. In the Allied effort to knock Italy out of the war, Lieutenant General Mark Clark's Fifth Army had carved out a small toehold on the beaches of Salerno in Italy. The Salerno campaign inspired Hall to flesh out his plans for the Brenner mission. On leave from his rigorous training schedule, Hall went home to see his family and friends in Connecticut. It was on his return journey that he put the finishing touches on the plan and wrote the letter that brought him to the attention of the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was born in the summer of 1941, initially called the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI. It was America's first central intelligence organization. Before the OSS was created, multiple government departments gathered information in reports sent arbitrarily up the chain of command in the hope that the most crucial information would find its way to the White House. No clearinghouse existed to ensure the information was shared, funneled, or packaged for White House review and direction. To lead the new agency, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt could not have chosen a more dynamic or qualified figure than Wall Street lawyer William J. Donovan, one of America's most highly decorated heroes of World War I and former Assistant Attorney General of the United States. He was a larger-than-life figure. Commanding a battalion of the 165th Infantry Regiment, better known as the Fighting 69th, Donovan won the Medal of Honor, a Distinguished Service Cross, and 2 Purple Hearts, earning himself the nickname Wild Bill. After the war, Donovan traveled extensively, resuming his legal practice and serving as Assistant Attorney General under President Calvin Coolidge. In the late 1920s, he served as personal political advisor for President Herbert Hoover. His position of influence and power allowed Donovan to build relationships at all levels of American society and throughout the world. In 1940, Donovan traveled overseas as an official emissary from President Roosevelt to report on Britain's staying power in the war. Hoping to win American support, Prime Minister Winston Churchill granted Donovan unprecedented access to Britain's greatest intelligence secrets. Churchill eventually recommended that FDR make Donovan America's intelligence chief. Many of the techniques and strategies America has used to fight every clandestine war developed out of Wild Bill Donovan's vision. After his appointment as chief of the OSS, Bill Donovan formulated an integrated combined arms approach of shadow war techniques. Persuasion, penetration, and intimidation are the modern counterparts of sapping and mining in the siege warfare of former days. Propaganda represented the arrow of initial penetration. Espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla operations would then soften up an area before conventional forces invaded. The integration of shadow war techniques was a groundbreaking approach to covert warfare. Donovan considered his main competition the Germans, saying they were big league professionals in shadow warfare, while America lagged behind as the Bush League club. The only way to catch up with Germany, he told Roosevelt, was to play a Bush League game, stealing the ball and killing the umpire. Making the best of his vast network of personal contacts, Donovan possessed a flair for picking the right people for the right job. Wild Bill threw together the OSS practically overnight from scratch. He organized the OSS into departments such as research and development, counterintelligence, secret intelligence, and special operations. To fill these departments, Donovan tapped his high society connections, Ivy League schools, law firms, and major corporations. The OSS may have been dubbed "oh so social" for its blue-blooded foundation, but in truth, the OSS recruited anybody with useful skills. Safecrackers freshly sprung from prison would purloin documents from embassy safes and deliver them to Ivy League professors for analysis. Debutantes worked alongside Army paratroopers. One study noted, the OSS undertook and carried out more different types of enterprises, calling for more varied skills than any other single organization of its size in the history of our country. For work in the field, the OSS needed not only the best and the brightest intelligence analysts, but out-of-the-box thinkers and risk-takers. Stephen Hall was an archetypical example of this group. Hall's Brenner proposal attracted the attention of the Special Operations, SO branch of the OSS. According to a memorandum sent to the President on December 22, 1941, SO was responsible for sabotage, fifth-column activities, and other forms of subversive action. SO also conducted guerrilla warfare, the establishment and support of small bands of local origin under definite leaders, and the formation in the United States of guerrilla forces, military in nature. To his surprise, Hall received a letter from the OSS ordering him to report to Washington, D.C. for training. After flying across the country, Hall reported to 2430 East Street, a cluster of masonry buildings located on a bluff overlooking the Potomac River. The new headquarters for the OSS, known as the Q Building, was sandwiched between a turreted brewery and an abandoned gasworks. Hall confidently walked through the entrance to undergo a brief orientation. His next stop was Area B, a base near Washington, D.C., designated as an OSS training ground for operatives, spies, and saboteurs. Area B, 900 acres of mountainous terrain lying 20 miles north of Frederick, Maryland, had formerly been a recreational project of the National Park Service. One part of Area B is now the Presidential Retreat, Camp David. SO's training regime had a number of goals in mind. Instruction of agent personnel recruited for infiltration into enemy-occupied territory, either as individual saboteurs and fifth columnists, or to organize and direct locally recruited guerrilla bands or individual subagents, or chains of individual subagents. The program was further designed to permit such agents to effect arrangement to supply local resistance groups. Hall's training included sabotage and organization of guerrilla movements. Before recruits entered the program, the OSS stripped them of their personal belongings and issued olive-drab one-piece uniforms. The recruits received code names to hide their identities from their fellow trainees. Hall's first instructor, dubbed the Shanghai Buster, or Fearless Dan, was in his 50s, thin and gray-haired. He looked more like Toothless Dan. British Major William Ewart Fairbairn was, however, one of the world's most lethal hand-to-hand combat experts. Fearless Dan had reputedly been involved in hundreds of street fights. As Assistant Commissioner of the Municipal Police during the 20s and 30s in one of the toughest cities on earth, Shanghai, China, Fairbairn developed one of the deadliest systems of street fighting known to man. Fairbairn himself called it gutter fighting. You are interested in disabling or killing your enemy. That is why I teach what I call gutter fighting. There is no fair play, no rules except to kill or be killed. One recruit summed it up this way. All of us who were taught by Major Fairbairn soon realized that he had an honest dislike for anything that smacked of decency in fighting. To him, there were no rules in staying alive. He taught us to enter a fight with one idea, to kill an opponent quickly and efficiently. The wiry master began by teaching the recruits how to handle the Fairbairn Sykes, a razor-sharp stiletto of Fairbairn's personal design. Fairbairn taught the recruits the art of silent killing. The knife is a silent, deadly weapon, the instructor would say. It's great for sentries. Never mind the blood, just take care of it quickly. The OSS issued Fairbairn's stiletto to many of its recruits. After learning how to hack and slash, the recruits went through Fairbairn's House of Horrors, a darkened labyrinth of pop-up targets, to learn how to handle a pistol in close combat. As the recruits moved through the house, trainers simulated battle with flashing lights and resounding gunshots, as Nazi silhouettes popped out of darkened rooms. Fairbairn emphasized a technique known as point shooting, getting off quick hits on the targets. Hall, already a crack shot, navigated the House of Horrors with ease. Finally, Hall and the other recruits learned gutter fighting. Fairbairn explained, "Gutter fighting is for fools. You should never be without a pistol or a knife. However, in case you are caught unarmed, foolishly or otherwise, the tactic shown here will increase your chances of coming out alive." One of Fairbairn's techniques, the tiger claw, involved stabbing an opponent's eyes with clenched fingers. Deceive your opponent. Make him think you are out on your feet. Now bring your tiger claw up from the cellar and put force behind it. It will knock your opponent out, but you must attack with surprise. Another weapon in Fairbairn's arsenal was a karate chop known as the axe hand. A single blow to the Adam's apple with the bony edge of the hand can kill a man. Fairbairn's advice on countering a bear hug was equally diabolical. Go limp, grab his testicles, ruin him. Fairbairn also taught Hall and the other trainees how to roll a simple newspaper into a stiletto that can be driven lethally into the soft, fleshy tissue under an opponent's chin. While in hand-to-hand combat training, Hall met his closest friend, Second Lieutenant Joseph Lukic, a 28-year-old paratrooper of Austrian descent. At 5'10", Lukic was the picture of health, possessing a keen wit and a basic command of German. The Clevelander, known for his silent presence, was a natural leader. He carried himself with the demeanor of Gregory Peck, a man of few words, often responding with a simple yep. He had a strong moral compass and loyalty to those around him. Like many leading men of his day, he was sentimental but reserved. As a result, his personality meshed perfectly with Hall's. Hall and Lukic went through demolition school together, where they met the masters of destruction, Frank Gleason and Charlie Parkin. Formerly combat engineers, the two instructors, trained by the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, taught recruits how to use demolition strategically and how to cripple a city. SOE training went beyond simple sabotage to destroying locomotives, power plants, bridges, tunnels, and communication systems. Gleason summed up their SOE-inspired training. We learned how to make people sick by poisoning a city's water supply. We learned how to make explosives from sugar and basic household supplies, how to start a fire that could take out a city, shitty stuff like that. We were taught how to fight dirty. One of Gleason's dirty tricks was a novel explosive substance developed by OSS scientists known as Aunt Jemima. The gritty substance looked like simple baking flour and could even be baked into muffins and bread, but after adding a blasting cap, Aunt Jemima was deadly. Gleason demonstrated Aunt Jemima to trainees by baking explosive muffins. Like other recruits, after finishing basic sabotage school, Hall and Lukic were let loose by the OSS on the local Washington, D.C. area to execute mock sabotage missions on American targets as if they were enemy agents. One trainee infiltrated an armaments factory and planted a dummy bomb. Once safely out of the plant, he boldly called the police. The FBI was not informed. If the men were caught by the FBI, they would likely be roughed up, even tortured. For an added twist of reality, the OSS would deny their existence. It was all part of the OSS's realistic training. After Hall and Lukic passed their final tests, they celebrated their graduation as secret operatives with a party at the opulent Statler Hotel, a stone's throw from the White House. The rooftop restaurant offered a fine view of the Washington skyline, a glittering panorama of evening lights. Lukic was accompanied by his future wife, Eleanor, a beautiful Broadway actress he fatefully met while on Liberty in New York. Remembering her husband's friend's eyes, she saw a strong, quiet, confident-looking man, a man with a mission. She sensed Hall was destined to do something important. Chapter 2. Looking for Trouble. Fort Benning's 250-foot jump towers loomed in the sky, 4 armed Goliaths made of cold, painted steel. The angular monsters knifed into the clouds, their massive arms each supporting a fully deployed parachute. The looming towers stood like gatekeepers to America's newest elite soldiers, paratroopers. Many paratrooper wannabes washed out of the program when they failed to get past the jump towers. At 6 feet 2 inches and 230 pounds, with arms that could rip through his shirt sleeves, 24-year-old instructor Howard Chappell dominated the Fort Benning Jump School's towers during the summer of 1943. Chappell, one of America's first paratroopers, commanded the giant gatekeepers. He was a sight to see, his blond hair slicked back and glistening, his posture absolutely straight, his body muscled and sun-bronzed. One of the recruits muttered to another, "Flash Gordon." As the Georgia sun beat down on raw recruits, they confronted the special challenge faced by every paratrooper, learning how to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. And Chappell was there to guide the way. "Move it! Are you strapped in?" Chappell made sure the harness fit snugly on the recruit. One of them seemed to hesitate. "Are you ready to jump?" Chappell barked. The man nodded as Chappell strapped him into a harness. The winch in the tower pulled the harnessed recruit into the azure sky. When the arm reached its peak, it released the chute with the recruit attached, and both dropped to the earth. Chappell, a star football player at Case Western, volunteered for the Army in 1941, 10 months before Pearl Harbor. Born and raised by a blue-collar family in Cleveland, Ohio, Chappell's father was a mailman. His ethnic origin was Germanic. He told his recruiter why he signed up. "There's going to be a war. I want to be in it." Chappell's sardonic humor, punctuated by his signature half-grin, was evident on his military application. With youthful bravado, he listed his profession as actor. Initially placed in an artillery unit, he soon moved to the military police. Because of his hard-nosed, ornery disposition, the job fit Chappell like a glove, but for one problem. Chappell frequently became the man in need of policing. Chappell put it best, "I got into a couple of scraps." Under investigation for several incidents, the young MP gained exceptional notoriety as a brawling bad boy. His infamy caught the eye of General Robert Beetler, then commander of the 37th Division. The division was training in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. "General Beetler bawled the hell out of me, but later made me his personal bodyguard," Chappell later recounted. The young private continued to impress the general, who recommended him for officer candidate school. "There were a couple more scraps," Chappell recounted, I ended up reporting to OCS with my shirt ripped to shreds. As at Case Western, Chappelle applied himself diligently to the training. Upon receiving his commission, a major commented, "You finished here like a gentleman, even though you weren't dressed like one the day you came in." The newly minted second lieutenant was transferred to a replacement depot, where they slated him for deployment to Europe. Chappelle wasn't keen on the idea. I was supposed to be put in a cavalry unit, and they were going to ship me somewhere else, Chappelle remembered. For a young guy, I was pretty obnoxious. I wanted more training, so I personally confronted a full-bird colonel and told him I would go anywhere, but I would not go to a replacement depot to just be a replacement troop. The colonel sternly looked at me and said, "Looks like you're looking for trouble. There's only one place for you." "What's that?" I responded. "Paratroops." In 1942, Chappelle became one of America's fledgling paratroopers. The airborne were then, and still are, a special breed of warrior. The men volunteered from all walks of life, some from the wrong side of the tracks. Airborne units subjected raw recruits to an exceptionally rigorous regimen of forced marches, calisthenics, and running, conditioning the men for the unique rigors of landing and fighting behind enemy lines. Airborne training was notoriously exhausting, both mentally and physically. The airborne had a high washout rate. "After I got in," said Chappelle, "I found out what the hell the colonel was talking about. It was tough." Chappelle got in on the ground floor of America's airborne efforts. The 82nd Infantry Division had just split in half, creating the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Divisions. Airborne troopers were elite soldiers set apart by their smart-looking khaki M42 jumpsuits, bloused into jump boots. After completing 5 jumps, they earned their precious silver jump wings. This decoration was highly coveted by regular infantrymen in World War II, and still is today. Airborne troops strutted around the regular infantry like gamecocks, referring to them dismissively as legs. The early airborne troops were a paradoxical mix of youthful wildness and Spartan discipline. Troopers were encouraged to believe they could lick any 5 men thanks to their superior training. As a paratrooper, Chappelle established impossible standards for himself, far above the norm, propelling him to do extraordinary things. With his deep green eyes, slicked-back blonde hair, and Herculean physique, Lieutenant Chappelle fit his nickname of Flash Gordon like a glove and easily obtained all the revelry he wanted. Chappelle summed up the experience in one sentence: "There was plenty of wine, women, and song." The paratroopers put the myth of their revelry to the test in nearby Phoenix City, Alabama. A small town on the other side of the Chattahoochee River, known for its run-down bars. One infamous incident involved a townie stabbing a paratrooper in the back during a drunken brawl at the Lone Star Tavern, killing him instantly. The barkeep allegedly allowed the assailant to escape through the back door. Upon hearing of the incident, the jump school paratroopers rose from the barracks and tore the Lone Star Tavern to the ground with their bare hands. Chappelle's commanders, however, noticed him primarily for his outstanding military prowess and assigned him the role of gatekeeper for airborne recruits. His job? To wash out men. I got up the next morning and went to the towers. I stood around like a big dumb hick trying to figure out what I was doing. The sergeant stared at me. I stared back. I wanted to ask him what the hell I was going to be doing, or I was going to act like I already knew. I went into the office, sat down. Several sergeants came in. "So you're the new lieutenant?" "Yeah," Chappelle responded. Chappelle's presence alone made it understood. Chappelle was taking over. It was time to get to work. Beginning by improvising, Chappelle developed the course that would turn a group of raw recruits into a well-oiled professional outfit. In typical fashion, Chappelle made it up as he went along. Chappelle also taught hand-to-hand combat in sand pits near the jump towers. Most of his knowledge that he used in training recruits came from personal experience. "I taught myself," Chappelle explained. "There are only a few basic moves you need to know: chops, kicks, and a couple of throws." Chappelle mastered these motor movements, becoming an expert in disabling armed opponents. He taught young recruits how to kill enemy sentries silently and how to defeat ground troops with their hands. Despite his mastery of hand-to-hand fighting, Chappelle was still a pragmatist, saying, "The easiest way to kill a man is to shoot him." Nevertheless, the hand-to-hand training he perfected would one day save his life. In the middle of 1943, Chappelle's life changed forever when he met Colonel Garland Williams. The colonel, as Chappelle recalled, was chief of the Narcotics Bureau in New York City before the war. He was a friend of Bill Donovan, and Donovan sent him to pick out paratroopers for service in the OSS. Apparently, Chappelle's congenial touch caught Williams's attention. Chappelle opined, "I gave him a real hard time." Williams then took me aside and said, "They're going to put you in charge of training." With his typical sardonic smirk, Chappelle responded, "Been there, done that." Nevertheless, the young lieutenant was ordered to report to Washington, D.C. After flying in on a C-47, Chappelle flagged a cab, which he took to the same nondescript building that Stephen Hall had earlier reported to. Wearing his neatly pressed khaki jumpsuit, silver wings glistening in the light, he swaggered up to the guard desk. The guy sitting there didn't look very impressive. "I'm here to see Colonel Williams." The next thing Chappelle knew, 4 guys came out of nowhere and began to grill him. "Who are you?" barked one of the men. Chappelle threw back an insult, he remembered, thinking to himself, "They're full of shit." The young lieutenant's blustery attitude got him through the door and beyond. He fit right into OSS culture. They had recruited him because he understood the necessity of taking risks. Chappelle continued to work his way through the corridors of the old brewery, requesting to see Colonel Williams. Williams's aide responded that he needed an appointment. "I'm sure I do," Chappelle responded, "but where is his office?" Once Chappelle finally tracked down Colonel Williams, the colonel greeted Chappelle and asked him a few questions about the quality of the paratroopers. After the conversation, an aide escorted Chappelle down a long hallway into the office of Wild Bill Donovan. Chappelle remembered his first meeting with Donovan. He looked like Kris Kringle in a uniform. He rarely raised his voice. He had presence. He only raised his voice when he got excited. Donovan got down to business, and the 2 men discussed the necessity of inserting commandos in an operational group. The OGs needed highly trained soldiers, men who could drop into enemy territory and fight. They would work as a team and perform on their own initiative. After shaking Chappelle's hand, Donovan told him, "Howard, we are putting you in charge of the German operational group." The OSS had selected Chappelle to train and command the American shadow soldiers who would fight within the borders of Nazi Germany itself. Chapter 3. Odyssey. The prow of the British luxury liner cut through the emerald waves of the Atlantic Ocean, flanked by several destroyer escorts. Her pre-war colors of white, red, and black were slathered under a dull coat of naval gray, with the forlorn hope of blurring the ship from searching eyes on German U-boats. In the bowels of the ship, one could discern remnants of an opulent past. Vestiges of mahogany and brass still adorned the bulkheads. The British Navy had converted the ship into a troop transport, her finery crated and warehoused for better times. Now she was hauling human cargo, troops destined for North Africa and Europe, including over a dozen operatives from the OSS Special Operations Branch, among them Hall and Lukic. Ship life, mirroring the monotonous repetition of the ocean waves, quickly led to incessant boredom. The men strolled between the port and starboard sides of the promenade, smoking and talking to no end. However, the tedium was punctuated with rigid naval procedure. Upon their embarkation, the captain had briefed the troop passengers with austere British formality. At least once a day, a lamp would illuminate and an alarm would sound general quarters. On the long trip over, the men had nothing better to do but joke with one another. The tomfoolery was endless. Numerous bets were made as to who would make another seasick first. The men mixed spoiled food into each other's meals and groused on unsavory topics to make the stomach churn. There was nothing to do but watch one another's hair grow. Hall's hair grew faster than the others. When he would peek out from the rows of 6-bed racks, his friend Joe often exclaimed, "No, the head! Get it back in there!" With all this horseplay, the men had no choice but to bond. Lukic and Hall, who had earlier developed a close camaraderie, became the best of friends as they developed a deep respect and admiration for one another. The uneventful trip spanned several weeks. Having traversed over 1,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, the convoy finally found its way to the shores of North Africa. The ship docked in Algiers. The men's first stop turned out to be a replacement depot, or repo depot. In the midst of olive-drab pyramidal tents, Hall, Joe, and two other operatives were put on temporary duty as platoon leaders of an African-American company. Their responsibilities included mail screening and censoring, as well as conducting calisthenics, close-order drill, and hikes. Regarding the black soldiers, Lukic said, "These are good men and lots of fun." At the time, the U.S. Army racially segregated most black units and assigned them white commanding officers. Hall, Lukic, and the two others experienced America's early race relations firsthand. Nevertheless, they treated the men fairly, challenging them with physical training the same way they would white soldiers. As a result, the men admired them. The experience stayed with Lukic for the rest of his life. During field hikes with the African-American troops, Hall and Lukic were strangers in a strange land. Maneuvering in and out of the tiny North African villages in the mountains outside Algiers, they got a first-hand glimpse of the nomadic Arab lifestyle. Lukic wrote to his wife, "Incidentally, they still dress as you remember them from your geography, with rope around robes, legs, and sandals, most of them barefoot. Every once in a while you'll see a tiny burro with baskets on each side and a cloaked Arab riding in between." He wrote about the idiosyncrasies of local culture, noting that the children, who often serve as a bridge between cultures, constantly needled the men for cigarettes and candy. After their brief stint with the African-American unit, Hall and Lukic received orders to travel to the OSS base in the mountains of Kria, near Algiers. Located in a mountainous pine grove, the operatives' base was less than 15 miles from the city limits of Algiers. Nearby, the British SOE had its own base in a luxurious seaside resort. The area included grounds for parachuting and other covert training facilities. Winding down a dirt road on the side of the piney mountains, Hall and Lukic arrived at their new assignment. They were given the duties of instructors. Hall handled demolitions training. While they bided their time, they provided demolition training to OSS Special Operations recruits on their way to occupied Europe. Chapter 4. Desperados. 3 large olive-drab 6x6 GMC trucks pulled through the main gate of the exclusive Congressional Country Club near Bethesda, Maryland. Incongruous guardhouses flanked the ornate entrance. An obstacle course obstructed the once-manicured fairways. Soldiers staged mock patrols through the woods. Washington's intelligentsia and members of Congress were noticeably absent. The trucks wound down the paved road, arriving in front of a squat white building that once housed club employees. In the fall of 1943, the lush greens of the Congressional Country Club had become the stomping grounds of America's first special operations teams. Recently promoted, Captain Chappelle stood on the side of the road, hands on his hips, elbows tilted forward in a gesture of assertion. His square-jawed profile revealed a cocksure confidence. 36 olive-drab-clad men hopped out of the trucks and fell into formation in front of the young captain. The military crispness of their movements rendered their diverse backgrounds undistinguishable. The line of men stood at parade rest, feet 6 inches apart and hands folded behind their backs. A more eclectic group of desperados could not be found. Former Luftwaffe pilots, Jewish escapees from German death camps, renegade Poles, and world-class athletes. They shared 2 things in common. They all spoke German, and they all wanted vengeance for the suffering of their families at the hands of the Third Reich. 60 years later, one recruit reflected, "The whole bunch were the craziest people I have ever met in my entire life." Chappelle briefly introduced himself and announced their mission: to go behind enemy lines and strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. Chappelle's German Operational Group, OG, was finally ready. For the past several weeks, Chappelle had been training the Italian, Greek, Yugoslav, and French teams on the basics of parachuting. Now, he was to be in charge of his own men. The precursor of the Green Beret teams that would follow years later, the OG units were segmented into teams based on the countries in which they would operate. The basic unit of organization consisted of 4 officers and 30 enlisted men, divided into 2 sections of 17 men. Each section required a variety of men with different functional skills: radio operator, medic, demolitionist, weapons specialist, and team leader. But all OG operatives had 2 things in common: aggressiveness of spirit and willingness to close with the enemy. Over the next several weeks, Chappelle's job was to forge his men into a team, separating the wheat from the chaff. If you had soldiers, he said, you know good soldiers from bad soldiers. All of my men were sharp. If they weren't, they were gone. One of the officers working with Chappelle summed him up this way. Howard had very high standards. If you didn't measure up, you were gone in 30 seconds. Chappelle had complete control over his unit's training. I just made up whatever I wanted. Chappelle was in a unique position. Because his kind of unit was new and unique, he was allowed a free rein. Unlike an officer in a conventional infantry unit, he was not under the thumb of an overbearing commander. He formulated his own dynamic training curriculum. Chappelle's ability to improvise was his most exceptional asset as a soldier. Like a master ironworker, Chappelle forged his men into a fighting unit, pounding them with a grueling regimen. They endured physical hardships such as humping long distances in mock patrols. The men learned hand-to-hand combat skills, everything from parrying a bayonet to killing an enemy sentry silently with a blade or a garrote. Chappelle also emphasized demolitions instruction to prepare his men for sabotage. The recruits delighted in cratering several of the sleekest fairways in the country club's golf course. The dining room in the main country club mansion was converted into a movie theater. Here the men learned German unit designations and insignia and how to properly gather and assimilate tactical intelligence. The training for an OG operative was informal and rank was dropped. The mission always came first. During training, one of the recruits caught Chappelle's attention. At 5'10" and 200 pounds, with black hair and a swarthy complexion, the Spaniard Salvador Fabrega was a character among characters. A cook by trade, Fabrega was multilingual. When he was once challenged regarding his language abilities, he responded, I speaks 7 different languages, English the best. Before the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, Fabrega owned a seagoing restaurant, a boat that featured a kitchen. He wined and dined his patrons on the open seas. During the Civil War, Fabrega fought for Franco. With the arrival of World War II, he left Spain to fight in the French Foreign Legion. Later, he deserted, which carried the punishment of death by firing squad. On the run for several months, the daring man changed his identity. Using his many connections and his exceptional fast-talking guile, he stowed away on a ship to the United States. Arriving in New York City, Fabrega talked his way into a maitre d' position at New York's famous Copacabana nightclub. During the immigration process, immigration officials moonlighting for the OSS recruited Fabrega into the nascent clandestine service. Here he now stood in front of Chappelle with the other OGs. I liked him from the start, Chappelle later said. He started out about 200 pounds. When I was done with him, he was a lean 170. Fabrega was loaded with nervous tics. If he didn't like one, he'd give you another. His most famous one, when he knew he was caught making a minor infraction, was a pitiful dog look. He would go, Oops, who's to say, me not know, and look all pathetic and speak in Croatian or some other language that no one understood. Chappelle reflected on their bond. I trusted all the men in my unit, but with Fabrega, I trusted my life. Despite Fabrega's antics, he developed a close loyalty to Chappelle, often referring to him as boss. The happy-go-lucky clever Fabrega possessed another important skill. Fabrega was a master scrounger and could acquire anything at the drop of a hat. His motto was, Tell me what you need and I will organize it for you. One of the recruits at the CCC made a dare while on leave. Can you get us some girls? Fabrega responded, How many do you want? 6, we replied. I'll be back, he said. What do you know? He came back with 6 girls. Fabrega and the rest of Chappelle's men learned how to drive German motorcycles, trucks, and even small tanks at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Much to the captain's dismay, the desperados were not all exceptional drivers. I drove across a field in a tank and promptly drove straight into a trench. The net effect was that the tank appeared to be driven by a drunk, one of the recruits lamented. After their brief stint with vehicle training, the German OG hit the rails and traveled to Chappelle's old haunt, Fort Benning, where they were integrated into the airborne training program. To maintain their cover as normal soldiers, the OSS issued them regular Army fatigues. Once barracked, one of Chappelle's old jump sergeants summoned the men to the parade ground and told them, While in camp, you always run, never walk, even to the mess hall. Those who cannot handle the physical requirements will wash out and have to return to the infantry. Them that make it are going to be the toughest sons of bitches in this man's army, and them that don't make it We don't want them nohow. The training proved arduous. Each man pumped out hundreds of push-ups, performed countless windmills with arms outstretched, where the shoulders burned horrifically, and endured many forced marches with 80-pound rucksacks. The Airborne's Training and Toughening, T&T program, soon merged into jump training. Parachute training was still in its early stages. The first step, jumping out of moving trucks, taught the body to absorb the shock using a parachute roll. The next challenge in the training took place at Chappell's jump towers. The 34-foot tower was the first test to see whether a man feared heights. Most of the men passed this initial screening. Next, they faced Chappell's 250-foot blackened steel tower. Chappell decided to impress his men with a feat of derring-do on one of the massive towers. Chappell removed the harness from the nylon risers of an already opened parachute and wound the risers around each wrist. Once at the top, he looked down at his men, ready to perform a death leap. Their necks craned to see him at such a dizzying height, and they shielded their eyes from the sun. Chappell leaped from the tower. All the way down, the captain held the parachute risers attached to the white parachute silk with his bare hands. He landed and executed a perfect parachute roll. One of the men commented that Flash Gordon did this just to prove his disdain for safety and good sense. Such derring-do and fearlessness epitomized Chappell's character. The final stage of parachute training consisted of 4 qualifying jumps from an airplane at 500 feet above the earth. The drill instructor divided the OG into 12-man sticks, and they boarded separate C-47 cargo planes. The engines made a steady drone as they approached the target drop zone. Over the drop zone, the men stood up and each checked the chute of the man in front of him. Next, the jump sergeant barked, "Stand in the door," then, "Hook up." The men grabbed the static lines attached to the backpacks on their T5 parachutes, inserted the static lines' eye hooks into the jump wires, and moved to the open door of the C-47. Icy air hit the face of the first men in the stick. Most of the OGs summoned the courage to jump out of the planes. After 20 feet of free fall, the static line pulled out their parachutes, which blossomed into white silk umbrellas. But the jump was not without risk. Equipment failure was an ominous threat, and incorrect parachute rigging meant death. Also, the shock of the harness on the chutes when they deployed caused strawberry burns from the tight buckles and snaps on the harness. And when they landed, the men had to roll properly in order to distribute the force of the impact. Landing correctly proved especially difficult, and men broke legs and ankles. Approximately 20% of the German OGs washed out during jump training, and one almost lost his life. One of the OG men recalled the incident. "We called him Fuck Up. He was very good as a radio operator, but he wasn't in good shape and he was an alcoholic. We could always find him at the nearest bar, and that's exactly where he was before our 4th qualifying jump. We yanked him out of the bar and he wasn't in good shape. We threw him out of the airplane and he woke up on the ground wondering where he was. His last recollection was that he was at the bar." That evening, livid with rage, Fuck Up filed into the barracks with the rest of the men. After the men fell asleep, the maddened radio operator stole an M1 Garand from the rack, loaded an 8-round clip into the magazine, and stalked Chappell. The man pointed the gun directly at Chappell's face, threatening to kill him. Chappell fearlessly walked up to the man. "Soldier, let me have it." Chappell gazed into the man's eyes. Moments passed with no words exchanged. The radio man trembled, his finger poised on the trigger. In a fluid, sweeping motion, Chappell snatched the rifle away and gruffly snarled, "I'm not going to report you because we need you. Shut up and go to sleep." The next day, the men formed up at the parade ground and ceremoniously donned their new M42 khaki jumpsuits. The commanding general presented them with their silver jump wings, a coveted honor for any soldier. With their silver jump wings on the breasts of their M42s, the OG men returned to Washington, D.C. The new paratroopers went out on the town, carousing with chests puffed out, wearing their smart Class A uniforms and jumpsuits. Secrecy for America's 1st Special Forces Unit became an issue, and Chappell had to do something about it. With all these men walking around in paratrooper boots and uniforms, cab drivers would pull up, toot their horn, and say, "Congressional Country Club?" I ran down into Donovan's office and raised holy hell. "I don't want my guys being trained here." And I got them yanked. The security-conscious Chappelle persuaded Donovan to move America's secret warriors to California's Catalina Island. Located 20 miles off the southern California shoreline, Catalina was an ideal location for amphibious warfare training. Known for its green hills and red-roofed vacation homes, Catalina was a resort town. However, Chappelle's men were headed for the other side of the island, a compound of dilapidated wooden buildings that served as a summer camp before the war. Life was soon to get a whole lot more Spartan for the German OG. The men embarked upon survival training. Dumped in the remote, unpopulated section of the island, they split into 6-man teams, and Chappelle instructed them to live off the land for 5 days. Armed with sharp knives and .45s, the men were expected to forage for berries and edible foliage. Some of Chappelle's men, however, discovered a better opportunity. Industrialist Philip K. Wrigley, the owner of the entire island and the son of the founder of the famed chewing gum company, kept a herd of dairy cows near the woods. The men shot one of the cows, and one man, who was an experienced butcher, carved the animal for dinner. Healthy and practically unscathed, these full-bellied German OGs rolled back into camp. Chappelle interpreted the men's resourcefulness as a positive trait and did not chastise them excessively. Instead, he filled out an IOU for Mr. Wrigley's dead cow. Before the OGs completed their training, Chappelle received a message. "Donovan wants to see you." Without hesitation, Chappelle complied. He boarded a ferry back to the mainland and took the next plane to Washington, D.C. In D.C., Chappelle made a beeline for the Q, where he reported to the American spymaster. His gray hair parted and his brilliant blue eyes sparkling, Bill Donovan was affable. With a smile, he addressed the captain. "Howard, I have just the thing for you." Chappelle quickly retorted, "Before you go any further, I'm really happy where I am." "But this is great," Donovan said with glee. With respect and a hint of guarded optimism, he responded, "All right, let's hear it." Chappelle was thinking to himself, this is going to be some harebrained idea. 60 years later, Chappelle couldn't recall the exact nature of the mission Donovan proposed, except that it was somewhere deep behind enemy lines. Donovan dreamed up all kinds of missions on a daily basis, some of them daring, some harebrained. His imagination was unlimited. Ideas were his plaything. Excitement made him snort like a racehorse. When Donovan proposed Chappelle take on this mission, Howard's answer was calculated. "General, I've got over 40 men back at Catalina waiting for me. These 40 men are imbued with the idea that we are going to execute a sabotage mission against the Third Reich. If I take a job now, I'm going to have to leave all these men sitting out there." Donovan shot back, "Oh, I know. You can take 2 or 3 of them with you." "I know, sir. That wouldn't do it, though." Donovan crumbled. "I can see your point. Thanks for coming in." Chappelle's loyalties lay with his men. They had endured numerous trials and tribulations for his sake, and he was not about to give up on them. He had a vision, an obsession, getting his entire team inside to strike at the heart of the Reich. Chapter 5. The Plan. Stephen Hall's fate rested on selling an idea. In the early morning hours of Thursday, June 22, 1944, his opportunity for making his plan a reality arrived. The OSS plucked him out of the demolition school in Algiers and gave him orders to fly to Caserta, Italy, on temporary duty. The date coincided with the 3rd anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Russia, and the Allied invasion of Normandy was only in its 3rd week. Hall hoped the interminable months of training and the dull grind of Algiers had come to an end. Nearly a year had passed since Hall penned his pivotal letter to the OSS, that he could block the Ampezzo Highway and the Brenner Railroad beyond. In Italy, he met with a roomful of officers from Company D of the 2677th OSS Regiment and laid out his plan. The 2677th was the unit that would facilitate Hall's mission. The meeting took place in a rustic villa in Caserta. Cigarette smoke wafted up to the rafters as Lieutenant Hall took his place in front of a wall-sized topographical map of Italy. The young lieutenant needed to convince the ranking brass of the 2677th that his plan made sense. The project had to be drafted as carefully as a case before the Supreme Court, recalled Hall. Seizing his moment on stage, Hall dramatically laid out his plan to first sever the main communication and supply routes leading up to the Brenner Pass, and then blow up the main route through the pass. With the zeal of a preacher, he worked the room, enthusiastically selling his plan to decision-makers in the 2677th. One of the most important of them was the man who would become Hall's case officer, Second Lieutenant